The stone is cold against his cheek. In the flickering light of the tapers, the boy can see the dust motes dancing in the air above him, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. He is Cosimo de Medici, and though he does not know it yet, he is about to be handed a sentence of death or exile. The heavy footsteps of the Signoria's guards echo off the walls of the Palazzo Vecchio, a drumbeat counting down the final moments of his freedom. He thinks of his father, Giovanni, the man who built a fortune from wool and shrewd loans, who taught him that wealth was a tool, but influence was an art. He thinks of the conspiracy against him, the jealous families, the old nobility who see his family as vulgar merchants who have forgotten their place. The cell smells of damp and rust. But in the silence, Cosimo makes a decision that will alter the course of history. He will not beg. He will not run. He will use this darkness as the canvas for a new kind of power. He will paint Florence red with the blood of its past and gild it with the gold of its future. To understand the dynasty that became the godfathers of an era, we must walk through the shadowy corridors of the Republic they were born to conquer. The year is 1397. Florence is a city of walls within walls, not just the ancient stone circuit that keeps out armies, but the invisible walls between men. The old nobility, the grandi, carry their bloodlines like daggers wrapped in velvet. The popolo minuto, the little people, shuffle through the narrow streets with their eyes down. And in between, there are the families who have found the cracks in the stone, the merchants, the wool traders, the money changers. They are the ones who understand that the old world is dying, and that gold, not birthright, is the son of this new one. On a street called the Via Larga, the wide street, a man sits in a counting house. His name is Giovanni di Bicci de Medici. He is 40 years old, with a face that prefers a smile to a scowl and eyes that miss nothing. The room smells of dried ink, lamp oil, and the faint, musty scent of the wool samples piled in the corner. Light falls through a window of oiled cloth, illuminating the heavy leather ledgers open before him. Each page is a landscape of numbers, a map of debts and credits that stretches across Italy. To the average Florentine, these are just figures. To Giovanni, they are the sinews of power. He runs his finger down a column, a loan to a cloth merchant in Prato, a letter of credit for a knight traveling to the Holy Land, an investment in a shipment of alum from the East, the precious mineral salt needed to fix dyes to fabric. This is the quiet engine of commerce. No swords, no castles, no oaths of fealty, just trust, a man's word backed by his gold. Giovanni understands this new arithmetic better than most. His father, Averardo, had been a merchant too, but he had reached too high and fallen hard, leaving the family with more reputation than currency. Giovanni has spent his life rebuilding, one cautious loan at a time. He is not a gambler by nature. He is aware of odds. But the world of 1397 is forcing his hand. The church, that great, rotting beast that straddles Europe, is bleeding. For decades, there have been two popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, France, each cursing the other, each demanding tithes, each plunging the faithful into confusion. It is a schism, a tear in the very fabric of Christendom. And where there is chaos, Giovanni de Medici sees opportunity. In the spring of that year, a messenger arrives at his counting house. The man is dusty from the road, his boots caked with the mud of the Roman Campagna. He carries a sealed letter from a Cardinal Baldassar Cossa. Giovanni breaks the wax with a thumbnail. The letter is brief, but its meaning is vast. Cossa, a Neapolitan with a pirate's soul hidden beneath a clergyman's robes, needs a banker. He needs someone who understands that the papacy is not just a spiritual office, but a corporation with lands, armies, and expenses. He has heard that the Medici are honest. He has heard they are discreet. Giovanni reads the letter twice. He looks out the window at the bustle of the Via Larga. A donkey brays. A woman calls out to a neighbor. This is his world, small, safe, known. To say yes to Cossa is to leap into a current far stronger than the Arno River. It is to bind his family's fate to the most volatile institution on earth. But to say no is to remain a small fish in a small pond, while the great fortunes of the next century are made by those bold enough to swim in deeper, darker waters. He makes his decision, he dips his quill, he writes back to Cardinal Cossa. Yes, this is the seed. This single act of commercial courage will, within a decade, make the Medici the official bankers to the papacy. But it is more than a business deal. It is an education. Giovanni travels to Rome, to the chaotic court of the antipope John XXII, the very Cossa he had backed. He sees firsthand how power operates. He sees the cardinals, fat and sleek as temple cats, their fingers heavy with rings, their minds always calculating the next election, the next alliance. He sees the machinery of Christendom, and he realizes it runs on the same fuel as his counting house, gold. The only difference is the size of the numbers and the stakes of the game. Giovanni returns to Florence a changed man. He is richer, yes, but he is also wiser. He knows that wealth in a vault is just metal. Wealth put to work, strategically, publicly, is something else entirely. It is a magnet. It draws men to you. In 1419, he receives a commission that will become the family's first great gift to the city. The Pope's old condottiero, the mercenary Captain Braccio de Montone, had been a brutal man, but in death he required absolution. The papal legate in Florence commissions a tomb for him, and the task falls to two young artists, Donatello and Michelozzo. They are not yet the legends they will become. They are craftsmen searching for patrons. Giovanni de Medici, now one of the richest men in Florence, pays for their work. The tomb they create is not for a Medici, but it stands in the baptistry in the very heart of the city, and every Florentine who passes it, who marvels at its classical beauty, sees the name of the man who paid for it. Giovanni is not just hoarding wealth, he is converting it into reputation. He is buying a kind of immortality. He watches the artist's work. He sees Donatello chiseling a figure of faith, her face serene, her robes falling in heavy folds that seem to move in the stone. He sees Michelozzo designing the architectural frame, drawing on the ancient Romans that everyone is suddenly talking about. Giovanni doesn't say much. He just watches, and he understands something profound. These men, with their dirty hands and their strange visions, are the real architects of the future, not the soldiers. Not the politicians, the men who can shape a block of marble into a moment of grace. He walks home through the bustling streets. Florence is a noisy, smelly, vital place. The great unfinished hole in the city's heart, the gaping wound where the new cathedral's dome should be, yawns open to the sky. For decades, no one has been able to figure out how to span it. It is an impossible problem, a hole in the world that seems to mock the city's ambition. Giovanni looks at it as he passes. It is a problem for another generation. For now, he has built his foundation. In 1429, Giovanni di Bicci de Medici lies dying. He is in his palace on the Via Larga, the same street where he once counted coins in a rented room. Now the palace is his. It is not a fortress like those of the old nobility. It is a home, solid and dignified, a statement that the Medici have arrived. His sons, Cosimo and Lorenzo, gather at his bedside. The room is dim, the candles gutter. The air smells of sickness and herbs. Giovanni's voice is a whisper, a thread of sound. He speaks not of God, though he is a pious man. He speaks of ledgers, he speaks of humility. Be careful what you do, he tells them. Do not attract attention. Avoid the public eye. Keep a low profile. It is the advice of a man who survived by staying in the shadows, by letting others take the bows while he counted the proceeds. Cosimo, his elder son, leans close. He is 40 years old, with his father's calculating eyes but a deeper fire burning beneath them. He listens, he nods, he kisses his father's hand, but even as the old man breathes his last, Cosimo knows he cannot follow his advice. The game has changed. The family's fortune is too vast, their network too wide. You cannot hide a fortune that large. You cannot keep a low profile when you are the bank that the popes use. To try to remain invisible now would be to invite the wolves to tear you apart. Giovanni di Bicci dies quietly. He is buried in the Medici plot in Santa Croce, a simple tomb. He would have wanted it that way. But his son, Cosimo, stands at the grave and feels the weight of the future pressing down on him. The shadows his father loved are about to be burned away by the spotlight of history. The gambler has left the table. Now, the master of puppets must take his place. Cosimo de' Medici did not inherit a business. He inherited an empire of invisible threads. From his counting house, he could reach out and touch Rome, Venice, Bruges, London. He knew the credit of kings and the debts of bishops. He knew which mercenary captain could be bought and which cardinal could be swayed. And he knew, with a certainty that grew with every passing year, that this invisible empire made him a target. Florence was a republic in name only. The old families, the Albizzi, the Strozzi, the Peruzzi, had run the city for generations. They looked at the Medici, at their vulgar money and their modest palace on the Via Larga, and they saw a disease. A family of wool merchants who dared to think themselves equals. They whispered in the councils of the Signoria, the city's governing body. They planted rumors. They sharpened their knives. The crisis came in 1433. Cosimo saw the storm clouds gathering. He He was too powerful, too popular with the common people who came to him for loans and favors. His enemies in the Signoria decided to strike. They summoned him to the Palazzo Vecchio, the city's fortress of government. It was a trap, and Cosimo knew it, but to refuse was to admit guilt. He went. He walked across the Piazza della Signoria, the great square where the massive stone copy of Donatello's Judith and Holofernes would one day stand as a warning to tyrants. The tower of the Palazzo Vecchio cast a long shadow. The guards at the gate eyed him with suspicion. He climbed the stairs to the audience chamber, his footsteps echoing in the stone stairwell. The room was cold. The faces of the Signoria were colder. They did not offer him a seat. He was arrested on the spot, not for a crime, but for the crime of being too powerful. They threw him into a cell in the tower's base, a tiny room known as the Alberghettino, the little hotel. It was a dark, damp hole. The only light came from a small window high in the wall. The only sounds were the jangling of keys and the distant murmur of the city he had helped build. For weeks he waited. He heard rumors that his enemies planned to execute him. He heard that the Signoria had voted for his death. He heard that the captain of the guard, a man named Federico Malavolti, had been ordered to poison his food. Cosimo stopped eating. He stopped drinking the water they brought. He sat in the darkness, listening to his own heartbeat, and he planned. But Cosimo understood something his enemies did not. A banking empire is not a castle. You cannot capture it with swords. You cannot starve it out. While he rotted in his cell, his gold was working. Bribes flowed through the stone corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio like water. Malavolti, the captain assigned to kill him, suddenly found it more profitable to keep him alive. The Gonfalonier, the man who had led the charge against him, found his allies melting away. After 40 days, the Signoria reconvened. They could not kill him. The city would riot, so they did the next best thing. They exiled him. He was banished from Florence for 10 years. He walked out of the Palazzo Vecchio a free man but stripped of his home. He went first to Venice, accompanied by his brother and a small retinue. He did not go as a beggar. He went as a prince of commerce. The Venetians, ever practical, welcomed him. He set up a new bank. He waited. In Florence, the city without Cosimo began to rot. The Albizzi, who had engineered his fall, proved incompetent. Trade suffered. The flow of easy credit dried up. The people, who had always loved Cosimo for his generosity, grumbled. The artists he had patronized, Donatello and the others, found their commissions vanishing. The city felt emptier, grayer, poorer. The exile lasted exactly 1 year. In 1434, a new Signoria, packed with Medici allies, voted to revoke the banishment. Cosimo returned in triumph. He did not ride in on a warhorse like a conquering general. He rode in quietly, a man in dark clothes, returning to his home. But when he stepped back into his palace on the Via Larga, the city knew that something fundamental had changed. The Republic still stood. The councils still met. The elections were still held. But from that day forward, no significant decision was made in Florence without the quiet consent of Cosimo de Medici. He never held a public office higher than that of a simple prior. He remained a private citizen, but he was the master of puppets. He controlled the strings of taxation, of foreign policy, of patronage. If a man wanted a job in the government, he came to the Via Larga. If a poet needed a patron, he came to the Via Larga. If a priest needed a favor from Rome, he came to the Via Larga. Cosimo understood that power needed a face, and that face could not be his own. He placed his men in the councils. He used his bank to reward friends and punish enemies. A loan could be denied. A line of credit could be called in. A merchant who crossed the Medici might find his bills of exchange suddenly worthless. It was a velvet glove over an iron fist. But Cosimo was not merely a Machiavellian schemer, though Machiavelli would later study his life with fascination. He was also a builder. He had seen the void left by his exile, the cultural desert. He knew that if he wanted his family to last, he needed to fill that void with something more permanent than contracts. He needed stone, he needed beauty, he needed God. He turned to Michelozzo, the same architect who had worked on the Bracci tomb years before. He commissioned him to rebuild the monastery of San Marco. The Dominicans who lived there had been living in squalor. Cosimo gave them a library, the first public library in Europe since antiquity, filled with rare manuscripts collected by his agents. He gave them cells for the monks, a beautiful cloister, a church. He spent a fortune. When Michelozzo presented the plans, Cosimo looked at them and said, "You are building a house for monks. I would not build such a house for myself." But he paid for it anyway, because San Marco was not for him, it was for Florence. It was for God, and it was for the Medici name carved into the stone for eternity. Then there was the problem of the cathedral. That impossible hole, the dome, still gaped open. For decades, engineers had predicted that any structure large enough to span the space would collapse under its own weight. But a goldsmith and madman named Filippo Brunelleschi had studied the Pantheon in Rome and devised a plan. He would build not one dome, but two, an inner shell and an outer shell, locked together with a herringbone brick pattern that would support itself as it rose. Cosimo believed in him. He funded him, not just with money, but with political cover against the skeptics. For years, Cosimo climbed the scaffolding to watch the bricks laid in that impossible spiral. He saw the dome rise inch by inch, year by year, until it finally closed, 8 million pounds of bricks suspended in the air, a miracle of engineering that had not been seen since the fall of Rome. When it was finished, the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore became the symbol of Florence. It still is. And every Florentine who looks up at it sees, in their mind's eye, the man who paid for it. In the last years of his life, Cosimo withdrew. He was old, tired, afflicted with gout. He spent his time in his study, surrounded by the books his agents had collected from across Europe. He talked to his artists, his philosophers. He watched his sons. The elder Piero was frail, sickly, plagued by the gout that ran in the family. He could barely walk. He seemed ill-suited to the brutal game of Florentine politics. The younger Giovanni was promising but soft. Cosimo worried. He had built an empire from nothing. He had turned exile into victory. He had used art to sanctify power, but could his bloodline hold it together? He had seen the envy in the eyes of the other families. He knew that the moment he died, the knives would come out again. He had created a masterpiece of invisible control, but masterpieces are fragile. One crack, one flaw in the foundation, and the whole thing could collapse. On August 1, 1464, Cosimo de' Medici died. The city mourned as it had never mourned a private citizen. The Signoria voted to inscribe on his tomb the highest possible honor, Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. They laid him to rest in San Lorenzo, the church his family had rebuilt. A simple slab of marble marks the spot, but the dome of the cathedral still rises above the city. The books are still in the library at San Marco. The power he built, the model he perfected, was now in the hands of his son, the frail and trembling Piero. The puppeteer was dead. The puppets were on their own. Piero di Cosimo de' Medici ruled for only 5 years. He was a ghost in his own body, carried through the streets on a litter, his legs useless, his face often twisted in pain. But he had his father's mind, sharp as a blade. He fended off the first conspiracies, the first attempts to topple the house that Cosimo had built. And then he died, leaving the entire Medici fortune, the entire political machine, in the hands of his 2 sons. Lorenzo, aged 20, and Giuliano, aged 17. It was the spring of 1469. Florence held its breath. 2 boys really now controlled the destiny of the Republic. The old families, the Pazzi, the Salviati, watched and waited. They saw youth. They saw inexperience. They saw opportunity. But Lorenzo de' Medici was not inexperienced. He had been trained for this since birth. His tutors had included the finest humanist scholars in Italy. He could write poetry in the vernacular that would be remembered for centuries. He could discuss Platonic philosophy with Marsilio Ficino in the Medici gardens. He could ride a horse, wield a sword, and negotiate a treaty with the same easy grace. He was not handsome in the classical sense. He had a heavy jaw, a flattened nose, a dark complexion. But when he entered a room, the room lit up. He had what the ancients called charisma, a grace, a magnetism that drew people to him. They called him Lorenzo il Magnifico, not because he was a prince, but because he made everything around him seem more magnificent. The first years of his rule were carnival. He gathered around him the brightest minds, the most gifted artists of the age. Sandro Botticelli painted his ethereal, melancholic beauties, his Primavera, his Birth of Venus, for the Medici villas. The young Michelangelo Buonarroti, a raw talent with a chip on his shoulder, was discovered sculpting in the Medici gardens and brought into the household, eating at Lorenzo's table, learning from his example. The poet Angelo Poliziano walked the streets with Lorenzo, composing verses on the fly, turning everyday life into art. Florence under Lorenzo became a theater. The city staged lavish carnivals, jousts, and processions. Lorenzo himself competed in the jousts, not always winning, but always participating, always visible, always the center of attention. He understood that a ruler must be seen. He understood that the love of the people was a shield against the daggers of the nobility. He smiled, and the city smiled with him. But beneath the gilded surface, the currents of hate ran deep. The Pazzi family were bankers too, older and more aristocratic than the Medici. They resented being second. They allied with Pope Sixtus IV, a fierce, nepotistic old man who wanted to carve out territories for his own family and saw the Medici as an obstacle. The Pope's nephew, Girolamo Riario, was the driving force. The Archbishop of Pisa, Francesco Salviati, was the willing conspirator. They met in Rome, in the Vatican itself, and they planned a massacre. The plot was elegant and terrible. They would strike in the one place where Lorenzo and Giuliano would be off guard, surrounded by the faithful, separated from their guards. They would strike in the cathedral. On Sunday, April 26, 1478, during the High Mass celebrating the resurrection of Christ, they would raise the host, and at that sacred moment, they would raise their daggers. The morning of the 26th dawned clear and bright. Florence sparkled in the spring sunlight. The bells of the Duomo, the great cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, called the faithful to Mass. Lorenzo walked from the Via Larga with a small retinue. He was relaxed, chatting with friends. He was worried about his brother. Giuliano had not come to breakfast. Lorenzo sent a messenger to rouse him. Giuliano, nursing a sore leg, was reluctant, but he came. They entered the cathedral together. The vast space was cool and shadowy, lit by the high windows and the flicker of candles. The congregation murmured. The great dome of Brunelleschi soared above them, a testament to the city's and the Medici's glory. The Mass began. The choir sang. The incense rose. Giuliano stood apart from Lorenzo, closer to the altar. The conspirators moved into position. Francesco de Pazzi and Bernardo Bandini were assigned to kill Giuliano. Two priests, friends of the conspirators, were to kill Lorenzo. The signal was the elevation of the host. The priest raised the bread. The bells rang, and in that instant the cathedral became a slaughterhouse. Bernardo Bandini lunged at Giuliano. He drove a short sword into his chest with such force that he gashed his own hand on the blade. Giuliano staggered. He took a few steps, his blood spattering the marble floor, his hands reaching for the altar, for God, for help. Francesco de Pazzi struck him again and again, screaming with rage. Giuliano collapsed. He was dead before he hit the stone. At the same moment, the two priests turned on Lorenzo. One of them, a man named Stefano, swung his knife at Lorenzo's throat. The blade glanced off the high collar of Lorenzo's tunic, a piece of luck, a miscalculation. Lorenzo drew his own sword. He fought back, but he was outnumbered. His friends, the poet Poliziano among them, formed a ring around him. They took wounds. One of them, Francesco Nori, threw himself in front of a blade meant for Lorenzo and died in his place. The cathedral erupted in chaos. Women screamed, men ran. The conspirators, realizing Lorenzo was still alive, panicked. They fled. Lorenzo, bleeding from a minor neck wound, was rushed into the sacristy, a small room off the main altar. The bronze doors of the sacristy slammed shut. Inside, in the sudden silence, Lorenzo leaned against the wall, his breath ragged. He looked at his hands. They were covered in blood. His brother's blood. His friend's blood. The blood of a beautiful dream. Outside, the city reacted with savage fury. The mob, loyal to the Medici, hunted down the conspirators. Francesco de Pazzi was dragged from his bed, naked and wounded, and hanged from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio, next to the decomposing body of the Archbishop Salviati, who had also been captured and summarily executed. They hung side by side, bishop and banker, swinging in the breeze above the piazza, a grotesque parody of the crucifixion. For days, the people of Florence looked up at the rotting corpses and knew that the Medici had survived. Lorenzo emerged from the sacristy a changed man. The golden youth was gone. In his place stood a ruler tempered in blood. He knew now, with absolute certainty, that the game was not a carnival, it was war. The Pope, furious at the hanging of an archbishop, excommunicated Lorenzo and placed Florence under an interdict. The King of Naples sent an army. Florence was isolated, surrounded, under the shadow of annihilation. Lorenzo did what his grandfather Cosimo would have done. He took a risk. He went alone, unarmed, into the enemy's camp. He sailed to Naples and put himself in the hands of King Ferrante, a man renowned for his cruelty. For 3 months, he negotiated, using his charm, his intelligence, his gold. He came back with a peace treaty. He had saved the city. He returned to Florence in triumph, but the triumph was hollow. The city celebrated, but Lorenzo felt the weight of every stone. He had seen his brother's blood. He had felt the cold steel at his throat. He knew that every beautiful thing he built was built on a foundation of hatred. He threw himself into his work, ruling with an iron hand wrapped in velvet, expanding the family's power, negotiating the balance of power between the Italian states. He became the needle of the Italian compass. But the joy was gone, the laughter was quieter. In his final years, he watched a new figure rise in Florence. A Dominican friar from Ferrara, a fanatic named Girolamo Savonarola, began preaching in the monastery of San Marco, the very monastery Cosimo had rebuilt. Savonarola did not praise the Medici. He thundered against them. He called down the wrath of God upon the city's corruption, its paganism, its love of beauty. He pointed at the rich, at the artists, at the philosophers. He pointed at Lorenzo. Lorenzo listened from his palace. He heard the crowds gathering in the Piazza della Signoria. He heard the name of God being used as a weapon against his name. He was only 43, but he was dying. The gout that had killed his grandfather and crippled his father was eating him alive. In April 1492, he was taken to the Medici villa at Chioggia. The pain was unbearable. He sent for Savonarola to hear his last confession. The accounts of what passed between them are legend. Some say Savonarola demanded that Lorenzo restore liberty to Florence. Some say Lorenzo turned his face to the wall and died in silence. We only know that on April 8, 1492, Lorenzo il Magnifico breathed his last. As he died, lightning struck the dome of the cathedral. The people saw it as an omen. They were right. The golden age was over. The fire was coming. With Lorenzo dead, the illusion shattered. His son Piero inherited everything. He was 21, handsome, athletic, arrogant. He had none of his father's grace, none of his grandfather's cunning. He was called Piero the Unfortunate, and he earned the name. Within 2 years, he managed to lose everything his family had spent a century building. The French king, Charles VI, invaded Italy with a massive army. He claimed the kingdom of Naples, but his real goal was conquest. He marched south, and the Italian states, paralyzed by their petty rivalries, crumbled before him. Piero was left to deal with the monster. He rode out to meet the French king and, in a panic, surrendered the key fortresses of Tuscany without a fight. He handed over Pisa, the city his family had controlled for decades. He returned to Florence not as a prince, but as a collaborator. The city exploded. The Signoria convened. The crowds gathered in the Piazza della Signoria, the same square where the Pazzi conspirators had swung from the windows. This time, the fury was aimed at the Medici. Piero and his brothers fled the city, escaping over the walls like common criminals. A mob stormed the palace on the Via Larga. They smashed the furniture. They tore the paintings. They looted the treasures that generations of Medici had accumulated. The family that had built Florence was now homeless, scattered across Italy as exiles. Into the vacuum stepped the voice that had been thundering from the pulpit. Girolamo Savonarola was no longer just a friar. He was a prophet. He stood in the Duomo, under Brunelleschi's dome, and his words echoed off the stone. He told the people that the French invasion was the scourge of God. He told them that the Medici had been tyrants, that their art was idolatry, that their philosophy was paganism. He called for a revolution of the soul. Florence, drunk on guilt and fear, listened. Savonarola preached a new republic, a republic of God. He promised that if the city would repent, if it would burn its vanities, Florence would become the new Jerusalem, the center of a renewed Christendom. The people believed him. The city that had worshipped beauty now turned on it with religious fury. The carnival season, once a time of Medici-sponsored revelry, became something else. Children were organized into gangs of holy boys. They went from house to house, demanding that the occupants hand over their vanities, pagan books, playing cards, musical instruments, fancy dresses, mirrors, perfumes, paintings of mythological subjects, anything that might distract the soul from God. The piles grew in the Piazza della Signoria. They built a towering pyramid of wood, with layers of kindling at the bottom and the most precious objects at the top, manuscripts of Ovid and Propertius, carved chess sets, beautiful gowns sewn with gold thread, paintings by artists whose names we will never know. Venetian merchants, ever practical, offered the city a fortune for the objects. The Signoria refused. This was not about money. This was about salvation. On February 7, 1497, they lit the fire. The flames roared into the night sky. The people danced. They sang hymns. They watched the smoke carry the ashes of their culture toward heaven. Botticelli, the painter of Venus, the darling of the Medici court, was there. Some say he threw his own paintings onto the fire. He had heard the voice of Savonarola and he believed. The bonfire of the Vanities burned for hours. When it was done, the piazza was black with soot, and Florence was a little poorer, a little darker, a little more afraid. But Savonarola's grip on the city was not absolute. The Pope, Alexander VI, the corrupt Borgia Pope, grew tired of this Florentine monk who denounced the corruption of Rome while claiming to speak for God. He excommunicated Savonarola. He threatened Florence with interdict. The city's mood shifted. The prosperity that Savonarola had promised did not come. The people grew hungry. They grew tired of the moral policing, the fear, the constant judgment. The final act took place in the same piazza where the bonfires had burned. In 1498, Savonarola was arrested, tortured, and tried. He confessed, under duress, under the breaking of bones, that he was a false prophet. On May 23, he and 2 other friars were led into the Piazza della Signoria. A scaffold had been built. A cross stood at its center. Below it, a pile of wood awaited. Savonarola was stripped of his vestments. He was hanged from the cross. When he was dead, the fire was lit. The flames consumed him. The people who had hailed him as a prophet now cursed him as a heretic. They threw stones at his burning body. They fought over the ashes to prevent any relic from being preserved. The wind scattered his remains across the Arno. The prophet was gone, but his shadow lingered. And in the ashes of Savonarola, in the silence of a terrified city, the exiles began to stir. In Rome, in Venice, in the courts of Germany, the Medici waited. They had lost everything, but they had not lost their name. And a name, in Italy, was a weapon. The Medici returned to Florence in 1512, not as merchants, but as conquerors. They came behind the swords of Spanish troops, paid for by a Medici who had become something unthinkable a generation earlier, a pope. Giovanni Medici, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, had been made a cardinal at the age of 13. It was a political appointment, a perk of family power, but Giovanni was no fool. He had survived the exile, wandering Europe, watching, waiting, learning. In 1513, he was elected Pope Leo X. He was the first Medici pope. On the day of his coronation, he is said to have turned to his brother Giuliano and whispered, "God has given us the papacy. Now let us enjoy it." And enjoy it they did. Leo X was a true Medici, a lover of art, of music, of fine food, of lavish spectacle. He expanded the Vatican palaces. He patronized Raphael, commissioning the stands that still bear the artist's genius. He filled the papal court with poets and musicians. He spent money with a profligacy that would have made his grandfather Cosimo blanch. The papal treasury, inherited from the warlike Julius II, was soon empty. Leo needed money. He needed a lot of it. And so he turned to the oldest Medici trick. He sold pieces of the future to pay for the present. He sold cardinals' hats. He sold church offices. And most famously, he authorized the sale of indulgences, pieces of paper that promised to reduce a soul's time in purgatory for a price. The money would go to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica, the greatest church in Christendom. The people paid. The money flowed to Rome. But in a small city in Germany, a monk named Martin Luther watched with growing horror. He saw the indulgences as a con, a theft of the people's faith. In 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg church. He did not intend to start a revolution. He intended to start a debate. But the debate spiraled, fueled by the new technology of the printing press. Within a decade, Europe was tearing itself apart. The Protestant Reformation had begun. The Medici Pope, in his pursuit of beauty and pleasure, had cracked the foundation of Christendom. The Medici popes continued. Clement VII, another Medici, was pope when the final catastrophe came. In 1527, the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, unpaid and mutinous, marched on Rome. They were Lutherans, many of them, who saw the eternal city as a whore of Babylon. They broke through the walls. For 8 months they sacked the city. They desecrated churches. They raped nuns. They killed priests. They used the tombs of the popes as barricades. Clement VII fled through the Passetto di Borgo, the secret corridor that links the Vatican to Castel Sant'Angelo, his papal robes torn, his dignity in shreds. The Medici had reached the heights of human power, only to watch it all burn. But the family did not die. It mutated. One branch of the family produced Catherine de Medici. She was an orphan, raised in the convents of Florence, a pawn in the dynastic games of her uncles. At 14, she was married to Henry, the second son of the King of France. She was small, plain, and homesick. The French court mocked her. They called her the merchant's daughter. And then, through a series of accidents and deaths, her husband became King Henry II, and Catherine became Queen of France. She was the outsider, ignored by her husband, who preferred his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. For years, Catherine waited in the shadows. She bore children, she watched, she learned. When Henry died in a jousting accident, his eye pierced by a splinter of wood, Catherine emerged. Her son was king, a sickly boy of 15. Catherine became the power behind the throne. For the next 30 years, she ruled France. It was the age of the wars of religion, a bloody conflict between Catholics and Huguenots. Catherine tried to navigate the chaos. She was a politician, not a fanatic. She tried to compromise. She tried to negotiate. She tried to keep her family, the Valois, on the throne. But the pressure was too great. In 1572, her daughter Margaret was married to Henry of Navarre, a Huguenot leader. Thousands of Huguenots flooded into Paris for the wedding. The Catholics of the city saw it as a threat. On August 24, the feast of St. Bartholomew, the killing began. Catholic mobs, urged on by the Guise family, hunted down the Huguenots. They dragged them from their beds. They cut their throats. They threw their bodies into the Seine. The massacre spread from Paris to the provinces. Thousands died. Catherine de Medici has been blamed for it ever since. The merchant's daughter became, in the Protestant imagination, the Black Queen, a mistress of poison and intrigue. The final act of the Medici story plays out not in Florence, but in the silent, empty halls of the Palazzo Pitti. The main line of the family, the descendants of Cosimo il Vecchio, had died out. A new line, the Grand Dukes, ruled Tuscany now. They were mediocre men, more interested in science than politics. They collected art. They built villas. They married their cousins. The blood grew thin. The last Medici Grand Duke was Gian Gaston. He was a broken man, an alcoholic, married against his will to a German princess who hated him. He spent his days in bed, surrounded by his ruspanti, a gang of rough men who entertained him with crude jokes and brawls. The Palazzo Pitti, once the center of a cultural empire, had become a sad, shabby place. The great art hung on the walls, unwitnessed. The great libraries gathered dust. Gian Gaston died on July 9, 1737. He was the last male Medici. His sister, Anna Maria Luisa, the Electress Palatine, survived him. She was the last of the line. She looked at the vast accumulation of art, the treasures that Cosimo, Lorenzo, and the popes had gathered. The great powers of Europe circled like vultures, eager to divide the spoils. But Anna Maria Luisa made one final, magnificent decision. She signed the family pact. She willed the entire Medici collection, every painting, every sculpture, every book, every jewel, to the city of Florence on one condition, that none of it ever be removed. It must remain forever for the people of the city and for the education of mankind. Today you can walk through the Uffizi Gallery and see Botticelli's Primavera. You can stand in the Accademia and look up at Michelangelo's David. You can wander through the Medici chapels, past the tombs of the men who built it all. The dynasty is dead. The bloodline is gone, but the art remains. The Medici were bankers who became popes. They were merchants who became queens. They were patrons who became gods. They bought, they schemed, they killed, they loved. They used beauty as a weapon and power as an art form. They rose from a counting house on the Via Larga to the thrones of Europe. And when they finally fell, they left behind a city so filled with genius that it still shines 500 years later. The last Medici, Anna Maria Luisa, died in 1743. They buried her in the crypt of San Lorenzo with her ancestors. The stone was sealed. The candles were extinguished. The family was finished. But walk through Florence at dusk, when the light turns gold on Brunelleschi's dome. Listen to the bells of the Duomo. Look at the faces in Botticelli's paintings. They are still there. The Godfathers are gone. Their gift remains.